distinguished guests, lords, ladies and gentlemen, welcome on behalf of the Freedom Association to this year's McWhirter lecture, named in honour of Norris and Ross, who both worked tirelessly in the cause of liberty. We sadly lost Norris in 2004 after a rigorous game of tennis. It had been awarded the CBE, recognised by Margaret Thatcher for his work in 1980. Ross, of course, was martyred in 1975 when he was assassinated by the IRA. For many here, this is your first McWhirter lecture. For others, along with me, it'll be your fifth. The first lecture was delivered by Norman Tebbit at the Carlton Club. All of them have been in London, except last year's, which was delivered by Caroline, the Baroness Cox, in the prestigious setting of the 16th century dining hall of Trinity College, Oxford, which is Norris and Ross's alma mater. They were twins, born in 1925. They both served in the Royal Navy, which makes it rather apposite somewhat that the TFA has moved to its new London office aboard HMS Presidents. And I can't help feeling that both Norris and Ross would have been delighted by that move. Both became sports journalists. It was out of a desire to provide facts and figures to Fleet Street that they founded the Guinness Book of Records, appearing regularly on the BBC's Record Breakers with someone who became a very, very good friend of mine over the years, the late, great Roy Castle. As the years go on, those who knew Ross are increasingly few. Those of us who knew Norris, both in his political work and his work with the Guinness Book of Records, are a dwindling band. But I was delighted to learn that tonight's guest was assisted by Norris to get elected as an MEP in 1999. Nigel Farage, leader of the United Kingdom Independence Party, or UKIP to use the vernacular. He's co-chairman of the Europe of Freedom and Democracy group in the European Parliament. And depending on what you read and whom you listen to, he's either a tireless campaigner for liberty, democracy and the restoration of British sovereignty, or he's a crank, a gadfly, a fruitcake, a loony, or a closet racist. Mostly. So say Michael Howard and David Cameron. I don't know about you, but I found in my brief political life, even being at the heels by Michael Howard myself, that the more you resort to hurling insults, it's invariably because you've lost the argument. Yeah. Ad hominem is no substitute for incisive, intelligent and reasoned debate. And Nigel Farage has given us many, many entertaining hours on YouTube, picking away at European Union hypocrisies, fallacies, inconsistencies and downright outrages. He joins us tonight from a relentless schedule, having steered the UKIP ship to double-digit delight in many opinion polls, to impressive by-election results, often surpassing the approval ratings of Nick Clegg and the official third party of UK politics. UKIP at the moment is surfing a near-perfect wave of economic meltdown in the Eurozone, profound concerns over judicial activism in the European Court of Human Rights, and widespread disillusionment with the main political parties. Main political parties. According to Michael Gove, Nigel now leads one of the mainstream. And this evening he takes the theme, "The EU is the biggest threat to our freedom." Would you please warmly welcome Nigel Farage.
been one hell of a week, I must say. When I took the phone call just 2 weeks ago from a very distressed lady in her late 50s, and she and her husband, both of whom have worked in healthcare and looking after disabled people, and really good citizens in this country, who for the last 7 years have been fostering children. Now, I don't know about you, but it's tough enough bringing up your own kids, let alone bringing up children who come very often from abusive and distressed backgrounds, and trying to provide an atmosphere and an environment of love, optimism and hope, and then just when you bonded with those children, handing them on to fully adopted parents. And frankly, I think everybody in the country who acts as a foster parent deserves a medal. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. But to take that phone call from that lady, who had explained to me exactly what had happened, that it was the knock on the door. It was the, we have been informed that you're members of UKIP. I mean, there are shades of the nod of the sort of East Germany and the Stasi. And for that reason, we think that your policies on multiculturalism mean that you're members of a racist party, and we're going to remove those children. Not only was that, when I first took that phone call, something that shocked even me, and I'm pretty cynical about the way politics operates in this country, but to think that here we are now a fortnight on, with those 3 children, not just having been removed, but now having been separated, families separated, and that in response to the national outcry, Rotherham Council have not even bothered to issue an apology. Shows you why organisations like the Freedom Association, since their inception, are actually more valuable and more important as part of our political discourse today than they have ever been. In the name of an ideology, in the name of a political ideology, that council is going about ruining lives. And of course, what they're trying to bury, what they want to hide, is the truth about what's happening in Rotherham. Would you believe there are 3,600 Slovakian Roma people now living in Rotherham alone? The Rotherham Council advertise on their website in all the Eastern European languages, saying that if you are an oppressed member, particularly if you're Roma, living in Eastern Europe, please come to Rotherham. Because we can provide you with housing, we will make sure you can access the benefit system, and there are people like Joyce Thacker earning 130 grand a year in a city in which 150,000 buys you a 4-bedroom detached house with a garden. There's a whole industry being created. Now, this is not the fault of those Roma children, but it is a fault, I think, of political correctness that has run through this country to such a degree that we're now prepared openly to discriminate against our own decent working class people in northern cities in favour, frankly, of anybody from the rest of the world. It is an absolute disgrace and an outrage, and you haven't heard the last from me on Rotherham Borough Council. Now, I really was thrilled when Adrian got in touch with me and asked me to come and speak at this McWhirter lecture. Of course, like everybody of my age, I grew up seeing Norris and Ross on the telly with Roy Castle, record breakers, and millions of us used to watch this programme when it was on. And of course, I didn't ever get the chance to meet Ross. But Norris I did get to meet. And I got to meet Norris in the sort of middle 1990s, attending Freedom Association events, attending some of the very early UKIP meetings. And there are 1 or 2 faces in the room here that I recognise from the early UKIP days when there really weren't very many of us. But that didn't matter to Norris. The fact that UKIP was a tiny political party didn't matter a damn to Norris, because his view was that UKIP was right. That we were standing up and campaigning on fundamental principle, and he was, right from the start, incredibly optimistic about UKIP's prospects. You know, he always thought that UKIP would become a serious force in British politics because he was of the view that our mainstream political class had basically sold out and given up on this country. My goodness me, how right he was. So when the European elections came into view, the ones held in 1999, and for the first time ever, proportional representation was being used in this country, Norris saw the opportunity that UKIP had. And he said to me, Nigel, I will do whatever I can to help you get elected in the southeast of England. And together we shared 6 platforms during that election campaign. And actually, because he was on the ticket, I mean, no one ever heard of me, but because he was on the ticket, we were getting respectable audiences. And they were coming in hundreds and 150s, and we were really doing some good. We were giving out literature and posters and boards, and Norris was amazingly helpful. And then one day, Norris rang me and said, I've got some really good news for you. He said, my old friend Patrick Moore said that he's quite prepared to come on a platform with you and I and say, vote UKIP in these European elections. Well, it was like a dream come true for us. I mean, we were, you know, we weren't even being mocked and derided in those days. We weren't even being talked about. And indeed, the BBC, and I'm sure you're all great fans in this room of much of the work of the BBC, but indeed the BBC, in that European election campaign, in 624 hours of national coverage in '99, the total UKIP content was 4.5 minutes. 4.5 minutes in 624 hours of coverage. And that was 4.5 minutes of me on the Today programme, of my first ever national interview, up against John Humphreys, who began the interview by saying, well, Mr. Farage, I have in front of me a copy of Spearhead. I thought, I don't know where this is going. He's in the British National Party's monthly publication, who single you out for great praise for the work you're doing for the white people of this country. What's it like to have friends like that? So I spent 4.5 minutes, you know, doing my best to fend them off. So we weren't even being mocked and derided. So the thought that Norris had got Patrick Moore to come on a platform was just fantastic news. So the meeting was held in the Assembly Rooms in Chichester, and there were hundreds there. Hundreds of people in there, crammed into the room, and outside queuing on the stairs, and the press were there, and not the BBC, of course, but all the local newspapers were there, and ITV had turned up, and I thought, well, I mean, this is the kind of boost that we need, not just for us in the southeast, but actually for UKIP across the country. You know, Norris has really done something fantastic here, and all was going well, I thought, until it got to 7:25, and I was there, Norris was there, and by now nearly 400 people were there. There was just one person missing, which was Patrick. And I said, Norris, he's not here. What are we going to do? I said, look, here's the mobile. You know, ring him, do something. So Norris rang him, and I saw Norris's face drop. I thought, oh my goodness gracious. Patrick had said to Norris on the phone, I thought it was tomorrow, but don't worry, if you send a car down to Chelsea to get me, I'll be on my way. So I thought, well, what on earth do we do? I had a chat with Norris, I said, well look, you know, this room's absolutely packed with people. We've said we're starting at 7:30, and there's no question that we've got to start at least by 7:35. Otherwise the natives are really going to get restless. I said, so Norris, you know, if you go first, that's fine. I said, but for goodness sake, keep it going as long as you can. Now, much as I admired Norris and everything he did, this was the only occasion on which Norris let me down totally. Because he got up and spoke, and those of you that saw him will know, he never used notes. He always spoke from the heart. He always spoke with passion. And he gave up and gave this wonderful, if short, speech, which after 11 minutes ended and he sat down. I thought, oh my goodness gracious, what on earth am I going to do? Anyway, I got up, and after 45 minutes, and goodness knows what rubbish I was coming out with, after 45 minutes, there appeared at the door of the Assembly Rooms in Chichester this vast figure, who I thought on first seeing him could probably cause an eclipse in his own right. And 25 stone of Patrick Moore began to make its stately procession down the middle of the assembly rooms, at which, of course, they all completely ignored me and stood up and gave the cheering ovation. And that was marvellous, and the cameras were flashing and ITV were filming, and I thought, this is great. UKIP's first touch with real big-time celebrity. And Patrick took the stage, inserted the monocle, and said, ladies and gentlemen, I don't believe in mincing my words. During the war, I hated the French and Germans, and I still do. Of course, and by now I'm staring at McWhirter, saying, well, thank you very much. I mean, this was the, you know, we've got a celebrity on board, can the ground please open up and swallow me? This is going to be a catastrophe. But of course he covered brilliantly by saying, not that that's got anything to do with it, I just feel better for getting it off my chest. And then Moore proceeded to give, just as Norris had done, a perfectly brilliant and beautiful, logical argument. And I'll never forget, you know, that one thing that both Norris and Patrick Moore believed in was that they were part of a generation, and indeed their fathers also were in a generation, who had to sacrifice a huge amount. In fact, in many cases, they had to give the ultimate sacrifice to defend the liberty, freedom, democracy and self-government, not just of this nation, but of the rest of Europe too. And that's a very important thing for us to remember. Very important. So for all of those reasons, Adrian, I'm particularly delighted to come along and speak at this McWhirter lecture, because that, you know, he did give me a huge boost back in '99, and indeed UKIP got itself elected to the European Parliament. 3 of us were elected, and we've moved on from there. Not quite yet to great things, but I think we're on the road, I believe, to fundamentally changing the shape and nature of British politics. At least that is my goal, that is my aim, and I'm certain and determined that we're going to do it. This whole European question, I mean, my first brush with it really was in 1990, October 1990, and in those days I was working on the London Metal Exchange. Unlike, of course, Clegg, or Miliband, or Cameron, I actually had a real job. So I'm able to say, hand on heart, that for 20 years in the city, I worked damned hard up until lunchtime, every single day. And this particular evening, I was in the wine lodge on Fenchurch Street, had a pretty miserable day, lost money on zinc, I remember, feeling a bit down about life, and somebody ran in. Because, you know, in those days, the pubs didn't have screens and prices, and mobile phones had only just been invented. And so a runner came in to say, we've just joined the exchange rate mechanism. Now, I'm not going to share with you my initial comments on that, but suffice to say, I thought it was a pretty bad idea. And that was really, that was the moment that really activated me on this whole European question. Because I thought to myself on that night, what in God's name are we doing? Haven't we learned the lessons of fixed currencies, of snakes in tunnels, of pegs? Hasn't a couple of 100 years of history taught us that every single time any nation embarks on one of these, it always ends badly? And why are we thinking that to inextricably link ourselves with Europe is where the economic future and prosperity of this country will lie? Because it seemed to me then, working in what was already a globalised industry, that when the telephone rang in my office, it may well be Frankfurt, it may well be Paris, but just as likely to be Santiago or Singapore. So I took the view very early on that in terms of trade, the UK should go on doing what it had done well for 400 to 500 years, and that is to treat Europe as another marketplace, but to focus on being a global economy. So it was the economics of it that really got me involved and mobilised and motivated to getting involved in Eurosceptic politics. And it was then, when Maastricht came along, that I sat down and attempted to read. Anybody in this room tells me they can read a European treaty and understand it all, well then you're a better man than I, Gunga Din. Because it's pretty difficult, heavy, treacly stuff. But it was fairly obvious to me from Maastricht that if this treaty went through, we would not be a self-governing nation. And indeed, young Gill here in the front row, and one or two others, did their best. And back to the earlier comments, of course, they didn't deal with your arguments. They just threw vile epithets at you and generally abused you, which is how these things happen. And I sat there in my city office, watching, listening to every word, reading every word of the Maastricht Rebellion, praying that the skeptics would somehow win. And of course, in the end, they didn't, because Major, I think for the first time in British parliamentary history, used a confidence motion to get a piece of legislation through Parliament. And that was when I became a UKIPper and decided that the only possible way forward to fight something that I thought then would pose an enormous threat to our freedom and our liberty was to try and take votes at the ballot box. Now, this was not an easy thing to do, but just 6 weeks after UKIP had been formed, in October 1993, I turned on the early morning news at 6 o'clock to be greeted with the news that a Conservative Member of Parliament for Eastleigh, one Stephen Milligan, had died overnight in what may be described as slightly strange circumstances. It all depends where you went to school, I suppose. Those that don't know what I mean aren't offended, are they? So, and I thought, well, in for a penny, in for a pound, I'll be the UKIP candidate. So I was the first ever UKIP candidate, and I stood in the Eastleigh by-election, and what fun it was. I mean, never before had I been able, in an open-top Land Rover, to go up and down high streets and shopping centres shouting into a microphone. I thought I'd rather like this, you know. And I remember on the night of the result, and that was the first big swing to the Lib Dems, you may remember, a seat the Tories had held for years, and the Lib Dems won it with a massive landslide. And I remember feeling very proud on that night that as UKIP's first ever candidate, I had managed, by an absolutely crushing margin of 48 votes, to beat the late, great David Such, leader of the official opposition. Funny, isn't it? They called him mad. His 1963 manifesto called for all-day opening of pubs. He won. He called for a reduction in the voting age. And it looks like that now is certainly going to happen in the Scottish referendum and may well be extended here too. He also called for Christchurch Harbour to be filled up with the EU wine lake, which strikes me as being a terribly good idea. So it was very much from little beginnings that UKIP was formed. But I mean, I campaigned through the 1990s and up until that election in 1999 with the help of Norris and the great Patrick Moore. I campaigned believing that the European Union was something that was absolutely against the interests of this country and all that it stood for. But I had the view that if that's what they wanted over there, that's fine by me. They're perfectly entitled, south of Calais, to have the European Union, as long as we were not a part of it, but just had a simple free trade deal. Well, I can tell you that my view on that has now changed over the course of my 13 years. I mean, you know, we're veterans, Roger, aren't we, of this European Parliament thing. I'm not quite as grey as you, but I'm catching up. My view of this has changed. I now do not think that the European Union poses the greatest threat to the liberty and freedom of this country. I think the European Union poses the greatest threat to the liberty and freedom of all the nation states of Europe. And I don't just want Britain out of this European Union, I want the rest of Europe out of this European Union too. You know, what the hell are these people got to do with Europe? What has Herman Van Rompuy got to do with Europe? He's a great mate of mine, old Herman, you know. We get on like a house on fire. Well, he owes me a favour, doesn't he? Because when he was appointed as president of the permanent president of the European Council, nobody had ever heard of him. I got up and questioned his dress sense. I mean, he's now a megastar. And I've done a lot of PR for that man. Now, for me, the pivot moment was this. You know, I went in there with lots of people telling me, well, it's all a great conspiracy. It's all a huge plot. You know, behind this European project, there's been from the start evil afoot. And so I spent the first 18 months in Brussels hunting high and low for the Donald Pleasance James Bond character stroking the white cat. You know, who was the evil genius that had planned all of this? And I have to tell you folks, I didn't find the evil genius. Because actually I think that if you look at this from a French perspective, life hadn't been very easy, had it? In 1870 they come. In 1914 they come. In 1940 they come. You know, 3 times in the average lifespan of a man or woman, Germany invades the country and does what it can to smash it to bloody pieces. And the French were literally destroyed by it. My own view is that the Battle of Verdun was where France literally lost its soul and its will to continue to go on and fight. You know, the losses, the physical losses, but also the psychological losses that France sustained in 1917 in that appalling battle were so great that when they launched a counter-offensive through Champagne in 1918, nearly 300,000 French soldiers mutinied, and in 1940, within 18 days, the country had surrendered and done a Vichy deal. Sometimes it's easy for us, living on this island, to sort of poke a cheap shot at the French as surrender monkeys and everything else. Just remember the sheer scale of sacrifice and disaster that befell that country, not just in 1870 to 72, but particularly in 1914 to 18. And I genuinely think and believe that Monet and Schuman and the men who were behind the original coal and steel agreement, and indeed who drafted that original Treaty of Rome, I don't believe they were bad people. I don't believe they were attempting to enslave the peoples in Europe into something that was a prototype for new world government. I just don't believe that. I believe they were desperate to attempt to stop France and Germany ever fighting again. And in a sense, the coal and steel agreement was sensible, wasn't it? Because if you trade with people, you don't go to war with them. You know, I mean, all of that made sense. But just as communism, which I think was the big idea of the first half of the 20th century, just as communism was based on grand ideals of making the world a better, freer and fairer place, and communism led to a government in Russia that finished up murdering 40 million of its own people, the same is true of the European Union. That the road to hell is very often paved with good intentions. And I'm going to go even further tonight than the title of this talk suggests. Not just is this a threat to people's liberty and freedom across Europe, I actually believe that the way this union is now constructed may well lead to massive, violent civil disorder and perhaps even civil war across parts of Europe. And I genuinely mean that and believe it. You know, I could have given them the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps, on a good day, after a good lunch perhaps, I don't know. But up until 2005, it was arguable that maybe the people running this project still had the same good intentions that Monet and Schuman had had. But 2005 changed everything. Because in 2005, we had the referendums on the European Constitution. You remember, Giscard was appointed to hold a constitutional convention. I thought it was very odd that they mirrored what the United States had done in the 18th century, despite the fact they hate the USA, but they had this constitutional convention, and they came up with their grand plan. and it was put to referendum. And the French, if you remember, had the referendum first. And in France, and I campaigned in France. I've got to tell you, even though my parents spent a ridiculous amount of money in attempting to educate me, my French is not good. And standing up at the final no rally the weekend before the referendum, and I had my script and I'd practiced it, but after about 2 sentences, I said, "Dites le nom," and they all cheered. Oh, that's not too bad. So I said, "Dites le nom" 10 times and sat down. It was brilliant. One of the most popular speeches I've ever given. But, you know, the French had this referendum, and of course the whole apparatus of state was used in France to make sure that the no side had no voice at all. And folks, whatever atrocities the British press have committed, and I do feel very sorry for the Dowlers and all these people who've been caught up with bad behaviour by the press. In fact, I myself am part of the second action on behalf of the hacking scandal. But when you see what a state-regulated press with controls over what can and cannot be published, and you see what happens in France, where convicted embezzlers become European commissioners and nobody can say or write anything about it, and where in a referendum the no side is not allowed through any single national newspaper to even publish an article under threat effectively of being closed down, you realise that actually Wellington was right. Have a free press, publish and be damned. But despite all of that, the French voted no. I remember the next morning thinking, what an amazing irony it was. What strange bedfellows politics makes. As I found myself at 6:15 in the morning, dancing in the fountains in Paris, arm in arm with the French Communist Party, celebrating the no. And that was great. And I thought, well, that's it. We've mortally wounded this European constitution. And then, just a few days later, there was the referendum in the Netherlands. Now, this coincided with a parliamentary session in Brussels. So I got it all organised, and we hired out half of the press bar in Brussels. Roger was there, and a lot of us there, 150 of us there, waiting for the result at 9 o'clock, the exit poll result at least, to go up on the screen. And there we were, and the result came up, and by a majority of 2-1, the Dutch had rejected the European Constitution. And I thought, this is it. We've now not just killed it, we've buried it. It's finished. It's over. The whole EU now is going to have to fundamentally change. And, you know, corks were popping out of bottles and it was all proper stuff. Great party going on. And as this was happening, I saw, wandering down the corridor towards one of the press rooms, a German socialist MEP, who's never particularly a ray of sunshine whenever you see him. But this particular German MEP, a man called Joe Leinen, and he'd worked with Giscard, and he'd helped to draft the Constitution. And there he was, walking down the corridor, off to do an interview. So I wandered across to him, with my glass of champagne, being as modest as I could be under the circumstances. And if you believe that, you believe anything. And I said, Joe, well, whatever our point of view, we have to say that the Dutch people have freely and fairly expressed themselves tonight in killing off this European Constitution. Will you come and join us in a drink to celebrate this result? And he looked straight through me. He said, Nigel, you may have your little celebration, but it doesn't matter. We have 50 different ways to win. And it all just drained out of me. Any feeling of optimism, of hope, of elation, of believing that we changed it, that we reformed it, that we would alter the direction of this thing, fell away. And I realised then in a moment that what we were actually up against was a new form of total and utter fanaticism. We are not the nationalists, folks. Those of us that believe in nation states, we're nationists, but we're not nationalists. They are the nationalists. They are the ones with their flag, with their anthem, with their currency. They are the ones who are determined, whatever anyone does, to impose their view on the whole of Europe. And so it went on from there. Within 48 hours, the former Italian Prime Minister, D'Amato, had stood up and said, we will now have a treaty. We will call it the Lisbon Treaty. And the good thing about it is, as it's not a constitution, we won't need to put it to referendums. And on they went. And that was the moment that I snapped. I had been a member of that parliament then for 7 years. I had behaved myself in and out of the chamber at all times, and that was the moment when I said, and I remember we called a meeting of various Eurosceptics, and that was the moment that I said, right, this has now gone too far. Now is time for us to stand up and fight against these people. And we fight against these people because we believe, and in fact we love, the concept of freedom and democracy for the whole of Europe. And I've fought against the buggers ever since, and I will go on fighting against the buggers until we're out of this and the rest of Europe. And they haven't got better, they've got worse, if anything. You know, the Irish had a referendum on that Lisbon Treaty, and the Irish said no. And the next morning, it was literally the next day, we were in the European Parliament, there was a big debate about Ireland, and a guy called Schulz, Mr. Schulz, leader of another great mate of mine, and you know, he does actually prove that in many cases the Germans don't have a sense of humour, but there we are. I am of course married to a German, some of you may know that. I'm married to a girl from Hamburg, so nobody needs to tell me the dangers about living in a German-dominated household. But Mr. Schulz got up after that Irish vote, and he said, we will not bow to populism. And it was after that that I started making my speeches saying, you know, you are bad people, you are dangerous people. And it goes not just in the Parliament, not just in the Commission, but even national leaders. Angela Merkel. You know, I met Angela Merkel last year. As I'm one of the 7 group leaders in the European Parliament, they have to invite me to all the official functions, which is something I enjoy far more than they do. And I sat down across the table from Angela Merkel, and by the way, I can let you all into a secret, that Angela Merkel in private is even more bloody miserable than she is in public. But I sat down with Merkel and I said, look, you know, wouldn't it be kinder to your taxpayers, who've just spent 20 years paying for the reintegration of Eastern Germany back into Western Germany, wouldn't it be kinder to them to say, you haven't got to go on signing a blank cheque in perpetuity, and wouldn't it be a liberation for Greece to do in effect what Iceland did? Default, devalue, and have an opportunity through being competitive, trading your way back to being in the black? No, Mr. Farage, she said. If Greece was to leave the euro, other countries would leave too, and that would be the end of our European dream. Well, there's a bit of me that wants to say I'll drink to that, but if you really think about it, it's very sobering, isn't it? 60% youth unemployment in Greece. Nearly 1 in 3 private businesses now gone bankrupt since 2008. An economy that is contracting now at 7% per annum, and that is rising. An economy that has now contracted by 25% since 2008. And what she's saying is it doesn't matter if everybody in Greece starves or are homeless, as long as we keep together the European project. Do you see, folks, the analogies with communism? When communism was failing, they convinced themselves the problem was there hadn't been enough communism. So my fear is that in those southern European countries, you are being driven to the point of absolute despair, that you drive people to the point where they frankly have nothing to lose. And desperate people do desperate things. And we are talking about the Mediterranean. We are talking about people who are naturally more volatile than we are in the colder climes of the north. And I now think that despite the fact that economic logic on the one hand says that the Eurozone has to break, I now believe that the political power on the other hand, is greater than that economic logic, and they will do whatever they can to keep this euro prison going, and that the way the euro crisis will be solved will be violent revolution. And I'm sorry to say that, and I'm not encouraging it, and I don't want it to be the case, but I don't see any other logical solution. So, Adrian, as I say, I'm even more bearish. I'm even more bearish than the title of this talk. This really does look very serious to me. But in this country, folks, we can be optimistic, because from the small little groups of the freedom associations and the Bruges groups and the UKIPs and the bastards and all these people, from all these little groups who, once they had been noticed, were much mocked and derided, we have been proved to be right. And we now have the clear, settled, mainstream majority view of this country behind our views. The vast majority of people in this country want us to trade with Europe, to cooperate with Europe, to be good next door neighbours with Europe, knowing that with the French that won't always be an easy thing to be. But they do not want us to be members of this political union. And I think there is now an inevitability about the European debate. Just as many thought it was inevitable that we join the euro, even though we didn't want to, I think it is now inevitable that we are going to have a referendum that decides our future as members of this union. I can't say to you that it's inevitable that we'll win that referendum, but I can say to you that I believe that we're going to, and I can tell you this: I would personally rather die in battle than never have the opportunity to take back that birthright, that thing that those that went before us fought for and defended, and that we should be absolutely determined to hand down to our children and grandchildren. Thank you.